Okay, so what we were looking at on last time was the idea of GDP and real GDP. And before we kind of look at that in a little bit more detail, let's kind of look at some of the problems with GDP as a form of measurement, right? Because what we've seen is something like this. Right, we said that GDP, it's like this price of apples times this quantity of apples, and this price of bread times this quantity of bread, and the price of computers times these computers. Or another way that we said is that, well, look, it's all of this other stuff, right? It's consumption plus gross investment plus government expenditures plus exports minus imports. And we said we can simplify this up a little bit by having C plus I plus G plus these net exports, right? XN, which is just equal to these exports minus these imports. We also saw what net domestic product was, right? So we said net domestic product was equal to GDP minus this depreciation, right? So that if you're looking at, say, gross investment, right, it was equal to, in essence, net investment plus this depreciation. Right? And so we kind of saw what some of that looked like the other day on Monday, where in essence you had basically about $3 trillion worth of gross investment. And you actually had about 2.9 trillion, right, in net investment. So that when you're looking at these things, I mean, you can kind of get a sense of how large some of these numbers are, or on a per capita basis, actually not that large. So for example, so we had something that kind of looked like this. All right. I'm going to erase this for right now. So that when we were looking at, say, GDP, all right, let's just change this guy to annual. Right. We saw our GDP here was basically $18.624 trillion, right? And we said, well, what are these different components? And we saw that some of those different components right? We saw here that, for example, we're going to modify this guy, change him to annual. Our investment here, for example, was, say, $3 trillion, right? We had basically $3 trillion here in investment, right? And so if you kind of look at that on, say, like a per person basis throughout the whole country, So we've got our 30572 100,000 million billion trillion divided by, yeah, there we go. So it looks like we had, oh, look, we had, $9,264 in investment per person. That sounds pretty cool. I mean, that sounds like a whole lot of investment, right? But when we're looking at this idea of depreciation, right, so here's our gross investment, right? We had, say, for example, $3 trillion in investment. But a lot of that was actually used up. And actually, that's this guy right here. Here's this fixed allowance. Right, this is a quarter. I don't want to put this in. That's private, actually. Graph. Annual. That's not the number I wanted. There we go. Of this gross investment, this number right here, 2.916, which I guess is kind of hard to see because we're down a bit. 2.916 of this was this guy, depreciation, right? So of this $3 trillion that we had in investment, clear, 3057.2, 100,000 million billion trillion minus our depreciation, 29167. $100,000 million billion trillion. 100,000 million billion. There's how much new investment that we actually had. 100,000 million billion, $140 billion. And if you kind of look at it, I mean, like I said, there's lots of different ways to look at these guys. 330 million Americans, $425 per person. Kind of gives you a sense of how much capital depreciates, right? And those cars, the factories, all that kind of stuff. This stuff depreciates a lot, right? So if you look at this on a gross standpoint, you got basically, like, say, for example, $9,300 per person in investment. You look at it on a net, $425. $425, that's not that much money, right? $9,300 per person sounds like a whole lot. Wow, that's a lot of investment. $400 per person, who cares? So we have this difference between GDP and net domestic product, right? We also have another one, and that's the difference between GDP and GNP. All right, so here's Texas and all that stuff. So here's the US, obviously. And, hey, look, it made it into the trash. And here's, here's Europe. All right, it's kind of a funny looking Italy there. So I got these factories here, all right? Because we have GDP, gross domestic product, and gross domestic product is everything that happens within the borders of the country. GNP is gross national product, and that's everything that happens by a country's citizens, all right? So if we look at this, like here's our factory, and this factory is Japanese, all right? And then this factory over here is American. All right, here's our field of blue and stuff. Yeah. guess we don't have blue stripes, but that's okay. You get the point. I don't know why I'm drawing blue stripes. This isn't Cuba. So we've got these three different factories, right? We've got this U.S. factory, a U.S. factory, a Japanese factory. GDP says, let's look at everything within the country's borders. So this factory's output and this factory's output will be included in GDP. So these guys right here are in GDP. What about this guy over here? He's not included in the borders, right? Because he's not in the U.S. GNP says everything by the country's citizens. Okay? Well, that's going to be this guy and this guy. What about this guy over here? This Japanese factory. He's not included in GNP, right? So, similar idea, right? You're just looking at the market value of all. This one says, let's look at the market value of all the goods and services produced in the country. This one says, let's look at the market value of all the goods and services produced by the country's citizens, right? So what are some problems with GDP as a form of measurement? We have several, right? And if you think about it, I mean, GDP is just a metric. It's just a measuring rod, right? I mean, if this is 1 foot, there's nothing that says we have to call that 1 foot. We can call it whatever we want it to be, right? We can call this 47 Klangons, right? You can call it anything. Or the distance can be anything, right? We don't have to say, oh, look, I'm 6 feet tall. We could say, I am clear. 0.00946 miles tall, right? I mean, you can do anything like that. You can make the numbers be anything. You see what I'm saying? It's just a metric. There's nothing arbitrary. It's not like God came down and said a foot must be this distance, right? We just invented this distance and we said we're going to call this a foot. When we invented this distance, we said we're going to call this a yard. We can call it whatever we want to call it, right? You can say the sodas down in the machines cost $1.50, or you can say the sodas in the machines cost 150 Lincolns. It's the same thing. You're just calling it something different. It's the same thing with GDP here. It's just a form of measurement, right? And so it's going to have some problems with it. I mean, we can call it anything that we want it to be. But some of the problems that we have with GDP is we've got this non-market production. Right? So this is production that's occurring outside the market, right? So if I fix my own car, that's non-market production. If I clean my own house, that's non-market production. If I hire somebody to fix my car, that's included in GDP. If I hire somebody to clean my house, that's included in GDP, right? So one is and one isn't. But that doesn't mean that the value that I did didn't have any value, right? We have the underground economy, right? So what do we do about the illegal activities? So these would be things like buying and selling drugs or paying people under the table, things like that. We don't have any accounting for leisure. So if we have two economies, country A and country B, and they both have, say, $30,000 in GDP per capita, but one works 40 hours a week and one works 30 hours a week, which country's better off? They both have the same GDP per capita. They're both able to buy essentially the same sets of goods and services, except country B here has an additional 10 hours of leisure, right? And is leisure time valuable? Yeah. And it's scarce, so it has a price. But we don't price it on here. Changes in quality and new goods. How do we account for the fact that we've got our Commodore 64, our 64 kilobyte machine, right? Right? Equivalent in today's dollars of about $1,500. How do you account for the fact that this guy is worth $1,500 in today's dollars? And in fact, if you look at it from a GDP standpoint, if you sell 10 of these machines, GDP here is going to be 15,000. Or we could have a phone that's, say, 64 gigabytes, selling 10 of these guys at, say, $600. This is 6,000, right? If you look at just the GDP numbers, which looks better, 1982 or 2017? 1982, right? Just the numbers. $15,000 worth of stuff versus $6,000 worth of stuff. But clearly, the 64 gigabyte phone is a whole lot better than the 64 kilobyte, essentially, keyboard. So we can have changes in quality in the introduction of these new goods that makes GDP look different than what it really is. It can make comparisons hard. We also don't have any accounting for economic bats. So if we have a hurricane come through and destroys a town, we have to expend resources to fix the town. GDP is going to go up. Does that mean we're better off? No. Right? You're worse off. You have to expend all of these resources to rebuild everything that you had before the hurricane came through and destroyed everything. So I kind of call GDP I call it a 30-inch yardstick, right? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to measure, trying to get an idea of this measure of output, of value, and it's an imperfect measure, but as long as you're using that same measure for every single part of the economy, typically we're going to be okay.